43 minutes after I opened the restaurant I'd spent 4 years building, 2 police officers walked through the front door. Every table was full. My staff stopped moving, and behind the officers stood my father. He pointed at me and said, "That's her." Mom was already crying, not because I was being taken out of my own grand opening, because, as she whispered while they escorted me outside, "If you'd just given Brielle half, none of this would have happened." 6 hours later, I came back. My key no longer worked. A note was taped to the glass. Family property. Closed until further notice. Dad thought that meant he had won. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then I called the one person he had spent years making sure I never compared records with. She answered and said, "Camille, how far back do you want me to look?" That question changed everything. My name is Camille Hart. I'm 37 years old and I live in Kansas City, Missouri. Welcome to Before She Spoke Stories. I started working weekends at Hart Family Catering when I was 15. By 25, I handled vendor contracts, payroll, staffing, deliveries, and every client emergency nobody else wanted. Brielle worked the room. Dad introduced her as the future of the company. Then he would point at me and laugh. "Camille handles the boring stuff." Everyone smiled. I learned early that keeping something alive did not guarantee anyone would admit you built it. In my early 30s, company profits started dropping even when bookings were strong. Dad blamed rising food costs, overtime, and mistakes in my department. I believed him. I renegotiated supplier contracts, cut waste, changed staffing schedules, and spent months fixing numbers I thought I had broken. Revenue improved. Dad congratulated Brielle publicly for modernizing the company. When I requested full financial access, he said, "Operations doesn't need ownership-level information." Brielle could approve thousands for branding shoots, influencer dinners, and event decor without anyone questioning her. If I ordered one extra case of wine for a large wedding, Dad wanted an explanation. Mom called it balance. "Brielle brings people in," she told me. "You keep things organized." It sounded almost fair until Dad announced Brielle would become vice president. I had trained half the employees she would now supervise. I waited until after payroll cleared, finished 3 upcoming event schedules, and handed Dad my resignation. He read it twice. Then he laughed. "You'll be back." I asked why he thought that. "Because you know how to run our systems," he said. "You don't know how to build anything without this family." That sentence followed me out of the office. For the next 4 years, I made proving him wrong my private project. I consulted for restaurants, saved aggressively, rebuilt my credit, tested menus in rented kitchens, and studied every lease before signing one. Eventually, I found an old corner space with brick walls and terrible lighting. I loved it. I named the restaurant North and Pine. No heart logo, no family initials, no sentimental reference to Dad. When he saw the sign for the first time, he stared at it and asked, "You're really leaving our name off?" "Yes." As opening day approached, Mom became unusually supportive. Brielle started asking who my investors were, what percentage I still owned, and how long my lease ran. Then she asked, almost casually, "If the place takes off, would you ever want someone handling the public side?" I told her I'd already hired a general manager. Her smile tightened. That night, Dad texted, "Family dinner Sunday. Important." What would you have done? Answered their questions openly or kept the business details private? Share your answer and subscribe to Before She Spoke Stories. At dinner, Dad waited until dessert. Then he said, "Brielle should have 50% of North and Pine." I thought he was joking. Nobody laughed. Mom said Brielle had years of branding experience. Brielle added, "I'm not asking to run your kitchen. I'd just be a partner." I looked at all 3 of them. "How much are you investing?" Dad frowned. "Investing? Camille, everything you know came from us." Dad said my vendor knowledge, staffing systems, and event experience belonged to Hart Family Catering. I reminded him North and Pine had its own menu, suppliers, financing, concept, and employees. Mom sighed. Why does everything have to become a fight? I answered. Because you're asking me to give away half a business I spent 4 years building. Brielle crossed her arms. It's not giving it away if it stays in the family. I said. No. Dad did not shout. That made the threat worse. He wiped his mouth, set down his napkin, and said, You used our contacts. Our methods. Probably our money too. I stared at him. My financing is documented. He smiled. We'll see. Mom followed me to the driveway and whispered that I should reconsider before Dad became serious. I asked what serious meant. She would not answer. Opening day was 9 days away. North and Pine opened at 6. By 6:40, every table was occupied. Talia hugged me near the service station and handed me a framed photograph of the restaurant before renovations. Keep this, she said, so you remember what you built. 3 minutes later, the front doors opened. 2 police officers walked inside. Behind them stood Dad and Mom. Dad scanned the dining room until he found me. Then he lifted one hand and pointed. That's her. One officer asked me to step away from the dining room. Dad immediately started talking over everyone. She diverted company money, client deposits, vendor funds, whatever she needed to build this place. I looked at him. You know that's false. Mom covered her mouth and started crying. That performance mattered. To strangers, Dad looked betrayed. Mom looked devastated, and I looked like the daughter whose own parents had just accused her of theft. I asked Mom one question before leaving. Do you actually believe I stole from the company? She would not meet my eyes. Instead, she whispered, If you had just let Brielle be part of this, none of this would be happening. That was not an answer. It was a confession of motive. 9 days earlier, they wanted half my restaurant. Now I was being questioned because I said no. The officers did not drag me through the dining room, but there was no discreet exit. Customers watched. Phones came out. One server started crying. Talia stepped between my staff and Dad and told everyone to keep working until she heard from me. As I reached the door, Dad said loudly, We'll sort out ownership once the records are reviewed. Ownership. He was already speaking as if North and Pine might become his. I spent nearly 6 hours answering questions and explaining transfers, startup costs, vendors, and loan documents. I was not formally charged that night. The complaint contained enough financial claims to require review, but not enough proof for the story Dad wanted. Before I left, an investigator asked whether I could document every major source of startup money. I said yes. For once, being obsessed with records felt less like anxiety and more like protection. It was after midnight when I returned to North and Pine. I put my key into the front lock. It would not turn. At first, I assumed I was exhausted. Then I saw fresh metal around the cylinder. Someone had changed it. A handwritten note was taped inside the glass. Family property. Closed until further notice. Dad had accused me of taking what belonged to him. Then physically locked me out of what belonged to me. I called Henry Cole, my landlord. He arrived 20 minutes later wearing sweatpants and an old winter coat. When I showed him the new lock, his face hardened. Who authorized this? My father. Henry stared at me. Your father isn't on the lease. Then he looked at Dad's note and actually laughed once. Family property? Camille. I have a 30-page commercial lease that says otherwise. That was the first thing all night that made me breathe easier. Henry contacted the emergency locksmith number listed on the invoice sticker. The company had recorded Dad's call. He told them I had authorized an urgent lock replacement because a former employee might have stolen keys. The invoice carried Douglas Hart's signature. So did the payment receipt. Dad had not simply changed my locks. He had falsely represented himself as acting with my authority. The lie had created its own paper trail. Talia had stayed behind long enough to secure our office computer, reservation records, invoices, and surveillance footage before Dad gained access. She met me at a 24-hour diner with a laptop bag against her chest. I didn't know what they were trying to find, she said, so I saved everything. Then she showed me the security footage. Dad had entered my office before the locksmith arrived. He had been searching for something. At 7 the next morning, I called Marcus Lane, the CPA who had reviewed my finances while I prepared to leave Hart Family Catering. He pulled up 4 years of North and Pine records, personal savings, consulting income, bank financing, equipment loans, one outside investor. Every dollar had a source. Dad's complaint specifically identified a $38,000 transfer as stolen company money. Marcus looked at it and said, "That transfer was yours before the restaurant existed." Marcus compared Dad's complaint spreadsheet against the original bank documents. The account number was almost identical. Almost. One digit had been altered, so my personal CD transfer appeared to match a Hart Family Catering account. I asked whether it could be a typo. Marcus zoomed in on the file history. No. The spreadsheet had been edited deliberately. Then he looked at the metadata. "Camille, this file was saved on a computer inside your parents' company office." Marcus traced the spreadsheet metadata to a workstation inside Hart Family Catering. I assumed Dad had edited it. Judith Wells, the company's former bookkeeper, corrected me. "Douglas barely knows how to format a spreadsheet," she said. "That workstation belonged to Renee." My mother had stood outside the restaurant crying like a heartbroken parent. The night before, she had apparently helped manufacture the number used to accuse me. I confronted Mom with the metadata. She did not deny touching the spreadsheet. She said Dad gave her figures and she cleaned up the file. I asked whether changing an account digit counted as cleaning. Her voice cracked. "Camille, your father was trying to protect the company." I said, "By making the police think I stole from it?" She answered with the same defense. "You should never have separated yourself from the family." Judith agreed to meet after closing hours at a coffee shop. She brought old handwritten notes from her bookkeeping days. For years she had questioned payments to consulting vendors she could not verify, equipment leases for equipment she never saw, and refunds without client names. Every time she asked Dad, he gave the same answer. "Camille handles operations. Check with her." I had been his explanation before I even knew there was a problem. I remembered every month Dad called me into his office to discuss operational leakage, food waste, overstaffing, vendor errors, last-minute refunds. I had worked nights fixing systems because I believed my department was draining the company. Judith's notes showed something different. Even during months when my costs dropped, the unexplained withdrawals continued. I hadn't been failing to fix the losses. The losses had never been mine. Judith told me Dad deliberately separated operations from ownership-level banking. I could see invoices, payroll, and event costs, but not every transfer leaving the main account. That explained why he always said I did not need ownership numbers. He did not fear me misunderstanding them. He feared me reconciling them. My competence was useful as long as it stopped at the exact line where his money started disappearing. Would you confront Douglas immediately after learning this, or keep tracing the money until every excuse was gone? Share your answer, and subscribe to Before She Spoke Stories. Brielle finally called me. She insisted she knew nothing about the police complaint. I believed part of that. Then Talia found screenshots from Brielle's publicist. A draft announcement read, "Brielle Hart Cross joins North and Pine as co-owner and brand director." The file was created 2 weeks before my grand opening. Brielle had not planned the arrest, but she had planned her position in the restaurant I had never offered her. When I showed Brielle the announcement, she started crying. "Dad said you were being stubborn, but you'd come around." I asked why she never called me directly. She said, "He told me you wanted him to negotiate because you get emotional about ownership." I almost laughed. Dad had convinced my sister that refusing to give her half my company was not a decision. It was a mood he could manage for me. Marcus found 2 old transfers from my personal savings into Hart Family Catering. I remembered both. Dad had told me payroll was temporarily short because several corporate clients paid late. I covered wages because 30 employees had rent due. Judith compared those dates with company withdrawals. The same weeks I deposited money to keep staff paid, Dad transferred large amounts out to accounts I had never seen. I had personally plugged holes he was creating. The first traced withdrawals were not business expenses, private club dues, investment losses, payments toward Brielle's home purchase, debt connected to Evan, and recurring cash withdrawals just below the amount that normally triggered extra internal review. Marcus said we still needed full records before making conclusions, but the pattern was already clear. Dad had been draining the company, then blaming the operational department I ran for why cash kept disappearing. That night, I finally understood why Dad had been furious when I resigned. It was not only because I knew the systems. While I was there, every shortage could be called a Camille problem. Every late payment could be blamed on operations. Every unexplained loss had a competent daughter nearby to absorb the suspicion. Then I left. North and Pine began succeeding without him. And suddenly, Dad's old excuse was building its own restaurant. Dad called relatives before I called anyone. His story was already polished. I had stolen family systems, manipulated employees, and retaliated because Brielle deserved partnership. I stopped answering every accusation. Marcus told me, "People can argue with your version. They can't argue with bank timestamps." So I built one folder containing only records from people Dad could not control. For once, I let him keep talking. Henry gave my attorney the complete North and Pine lease file. My name appeared as tenant and guarantor. Dad's name appeared nowhere. The renovation approvals, insurance certificates, and contractor permissions were all mine. Then Henry added the locksmith recording. Dad could be heard saying, "My daughter authorized me to secure the property." I never had. His attempt to make North and Pine look like family property had created independent evidence that it wasn't. Talia reviewed the office surveillance from grand opening night. Dad entered after I was taken away and opened 3 drawers. He ignored cash, ignored reservation records, ignored employee files. He went directly to the cabinet containing startup financing documents. "He wasn't looking for proof you stole," Talia said. "He was looking for whatever proved you didn't." That changed how I understood the lockout completely. My attorney submitted my loan records, consulting income, equipment financing, and the original $38,000 CD transfer. Investigators compared them with Dad's altered spreadsheet. The numbers no longer matched his allegation. Nobody declared me magically cleared overnight. But the direction changed. Questions shifted away from where North and Pine's money came from, and toward why someone had altered financial records before reporting me. Dad had expected scrutiny to stop with my name. It didn't. Marcus showed Brielle the transfer connected to her home down payment. Dad had told her it came from a successful year-end bonus. Judith's records showed the company had been struggling that quarter. Part of the money came from the same unexplained withdrawals I had spent months trying to offset. Brielle looked at me and whispered, "He told me you were the reason there wasn't enough money for raises." I said, "He told me that too." The trail reached Evan next. Several payments Dad described as vendor consulting expenses matched debt tied to Evan's failed investment partnership. Evan admitted Douglas had offered to handle it privately. He never asked where the money came from. Brielle turned on him. "You let my family company pay your debt?" Evan answered, "Your dad said it was his money." That sentence had apparently protected more than one person. I met Mom alone. I asked why she altered the spreadsheet. She cried before answering. "If North and Pine succeeds, everyone will know you never needed your father." I waited. Then she added, "And Brielle needs something secure." There it was. This had never been about protecting Hart Family Catering. Mom had helped manufacture evidence because my independence threatened Dad's identity, and my success made Brielle's dependence harder to justify. I asked Mom whether she understood what could have happened if investigators believed the altered file. She said, "Douglas never thought it would go that far." I stared at her. 2 officers walked into my restaurant. She looked down. Then I said the only part that mattered. "You wanted Brielle to have something secure, so you helped destroy mine." Mom whispered, "That's not fair." I answered, "No, it isn't." Dad announced a family meeting and told everyone I was ready to come back to reason. His proposal was almost insulting. I would drop any complaint over the locks. He would withdraw his accusations. Brielle would receive 25% of North and Pine instead of half, and the family would stop discussing old catering accounts. Dad called it compromise. I called Marcus afterward. He still thinks the restaurant is what I'm negotiating over. Marcus said, "Good." I agreed to meet after North and Pine closed Sunday night. Dad arrived smiling. Mom sat beside him. Brielle and Evan came separately. Dad expected another family argument. Instead, Henry was already there with the lease. Talia had the surveillance file. Marcus carried the startup records. Judith placed an old Hart family catering ledger on the table. Dad stopped at the doorway. Then Judith opened to a page from 8 years earlier and said, "Douglas, should we start with the first account you blamed on Camille? Or the last one?" Judith opened the old ledger to a payment Dad had blamed on one of my vendor mistakes. The vendor didn't exist. Marcus matched the amount to a transfer into Dad's personal investment account. Then Judith turned 3 more pages. Same pattern. Different descriptions. For years, Dad had hidden withdrawals inside operational categories I controlled, knowing any shortage would eventually circle back to me. The first accusation at North and Pine wasn't new. It was recycled. Marcus placed the altered police spreadsheet beside the original company record. Mom's edit history was still embedded in the file. Renee finally stopped denying it. She said Dad gave her the numbers and told her the restaurant had been built with family money. I asked whether she verified anything. She whispered, "I trusted your father." I said, "No. You chose his accusation over my records." That distinction mattered. Trust was passive. She had actively changed the evidence. Marcus summarized the traced withdrawals: private club dues, investment losses, cash advances, part of Brielle's house down payment, payments connected to Evan's debt. Dad tried calling them owner distributions. Judith reminded him the company had been struggling to meet payroll during several of those same months. Then I slid forward my own bank statements. Twice, I had used personal savings to cover employee checks while Dad was moving money out. He had called me irresponsible with cash. I had been financing his shortages. Brielle looked at the payment used for her house and started crying. Dad told me that was his bonus. Then she looked at me. "He also told me there wasn't money to give you a raise." I nodded. Brielle had benefited, but she finally understood the structure. Dad had made her feel specially provided for by quietly taking from the business I kept alive. Her comfort had been turned into evidence that I deserved less. Even with the records spread across the table, Dad tried one last pivot. "Fine," he said. "Accounting got messy. That doesn't change the fact Brielle deserves a piece of North and Pine." I almost laughed. "You had me removed from my own restaurant, changed my locks, and accused me of theft." He answered, "Because you forced things too far." I said, "No. I said one word you couldn't control." "No." My attorney provided investigators with the clean financing trail, altered spreadsheet metadata, locksmith recording, lease documents, and Judith's accounting notes. The original allegations against me lost credibility quickly. No one marched Dad away in handcuffs that night. Instead, questions expanded into who created the altered records, who authorized the false lock change, and whether older company transactions required formal review. Dad had used official scrutiny to frighten me. Now he had to answer it himself. Once longtime employees learned Judith had left, several began asking their own questions. A few vendors demanded overdue balances before accepting new events. 2 corporate clients paused bookings while the accounting was reviewed. Brielle stepped away from the promised vice president role. Evan stopped calling the business family money. Dad blamed me for damaging his company. Judith corrected him quietly. "Camille leaving didn't create the holes, Douglas. It just stopped covering them." People had filmed the police walking me out on opening night. One local page asked for my side. I refused to turn the investigation into a public family spectacle while facts were still being reviewed. North and Pine released one statement. Ownership and operations remain unchanged. That was enough. Dad had always depended on controlling the loudest story. I chose documentation over performance. Would you have exposed Douglas publicly after what he did, or let the financial records handle the consequences? Share your answer and subscribe to Before She Spoke Stories. 6 months later, North and Pine was still open, not famous, not magically packed every night, just healthy. Talia framed our original grand opening menu and hung it inside my office. On the back, she had written, "Still yours." I changed the locks again through Henry's approved contractor. This time there were no family keys, no emergency copies for Mom, no promised ownership for Brielle, just one lease, one business, one owner. Me. On a Saturday night, I walked past the same table where the officers first approached me. People were laughing over dinner. The kitchen was steady. Nobody in the room knew how close Dad came to destroying the opening night, and I was fine with that. My father thought calling me a thief would scare me into giving my sister half of what I built. Instead, the records exposed something else. For years, I had been blamed for losses I was actually covering. Dad didn't lose North and Pine because I fought harder. He lost it because, for the first time, I owned something he couldn't rewrite.